Ethan Bennett had always been the center of attention, both in the business world and in New York's society columns. At just 29 years old, he was the heir to one of the largest tech empires in the United States, Bennett Tech, founded by his late father. Smart and charismatic, Ethan had a knack for turning ideas into gold, but his life never truly demanded any real effort. Born with a silver spoon in his mouth, he grew up surrounded by luxury, attending the best schools and surrounded by people who admired him more for the family name he carried than for who he really was. To society, Ethan's life seemed perfect. Glamorous parties, extravagant trips, and a select group of friends who always accompanied him. Among those friends was Brandon Carter, his best friend and business partner, someone he thought he could always count on, or so he believed. However, behind the glitz and glamour, Ethan was constantly pressured by his mother, Margaret Bennett, a strict and controlling woman. After her husband's death, Margaret took over the family and business reins, subtly maintaining control over Ethan. She believed the family's image was their most valuable asset, and to keep it intact, Ethan had to follow a path she had set for him, marry someone from high society, and continue expanding the Bennett empire. But Ethan always felt something was missing. His days were filled with a hollow routine, punctuated only by social events and business meetings. The allure of fortune no longer satisfied him as it once had. He longed for something different, a real connection amid the superficiality that surrounded him. One ordinary night, after an intense argument with his mother about the company's demands and the life expectations she imposed on him, Ethan decided to escape the oppressive Manhattan environment. He drove aimlessly through the city until, in the simpler streets of Brooklyn, he spotted a small corner bakery. The contrast with his world of luxury drew him in. There, without any pretension, he entered, seeking something that would bring him a brief moment of peace. Inside the bakery, the scent of freshly baked bread filled the air, and behind the counter was Emma Davis, a simple woman with a genuine smile, working to support her sick mother. Emma, 24, had always been a hard worker. She woke up every day before dawn, serving bakery customers with kindness, and at the end of the day, she took care of her mother with the same dedication. Life for Emma was a series of sacrifices, but she never complained. She had learned early on that the road to success was paved with effort and resilience. When Ethan walked into the bakery, tired and visibly worn out, Emma noticed something different about him. He didn't seem like the usual bakery customer, with his expensive clothes and elegant posture. However, when she approached to serve him, she realized that behind that image of a successful businessman, there was a certain melancholy. "What will it be today?" Emma asked in her soft voice as she served him a coffee. Ethan, surprised by her simplicity and sincerity, replied with a faint smile, "A coffee, and maybe a break from life." They exchanged glances, and in that brief moment, something unexpected happened. A genuine connection emerged, something Ethan hadn't felt in a long time. Their conversation flowed naturally, as if they were old friends, despite living in completely different worlds. Ethan found in Emma a peace he had never experienced in the elitist environment that had always surrounded him, and she in turn saw in Ethan someone different from what she first imagined, more human, more vulnerable. The night unfolded unexpectedly. After the bakery closed, the two walked through the quiet neighborhood streets, talking about dreams, fears, and life in general. Ethan, used to being surrounded by people who treated him with reverence or self-interest, felt that with Emma, he could just be himself. And for the first time, Emma allowed herself to dream of something beyond the harsh reality she lived in. That night ended in an unexpected and intense way, and Ethan, accustomed to superficial and casual relationships, let himself be swept up by the moment's emotion. For him, it was just an escape from his stifling life. But for Emma, that connection represented something deeper. What neither of them realized was that this casual night would forever change both of their destinies. In the days that followed, Ethan returned to his usual routine: work at Bennett Tech, business meetings, and the constant pressure from his mother to align with the family's expectations. Everything seemed to have returned to normal, as if the night with Emma was just a distant memory. The days followed their usual pattern for Ethan Bennett. He had resumed focusing on the business, frequently traveling for meetings, attending events with his mother, and trying to maintain the impeccable Bennett family image. Although the night with Emma Davis remained in his memory as something special, he didn't think much of it, believing it was just a moment of relaxation. Meanwhile, Emma tried to go on with her life as usual, but something unsettled her. A few weeks after that night with Ethan, she began to notice changes in her body. extreme fatigue, morning sickness, and a significant delay in her cycle. At first, she attributed the symptoms to the stress of her routine, but as the days passed and the feeling of unease persisted, Emma decided to go to the pharmacy and buy a pregnancy test. The possibility of being pregnant frightened her, but she couldn't ignore the signs. Back at her small Brooklyn apartment, Emma faced the truth. The pregnancy test was positive. Her hands trembled as she held the result, and a mixture of emotions overwhelmed her. Fear, anxiety, and even a certain confused happiness filled her heart. Becoming a mother was something she had always wanted in the distant future. But now, alone and with so many responsibilities, the situation felt overwhelming. As the days went by, the reality of the pregnancy became more concrete, and Emma knew she had to tell Ethan. Although they hadn't kept in touch since that night, she felt he deserved to know. After all, he was the father. However, the idea of facing Ethan and everything his world represented terrified her. How would someone like him, heir to a multi-million-dollar empire, react to the fact that he had gotten a simple bakery worker pregnant? The implications seemed immense, but Emma knew she couldn't run from this responsibility. Determined, Emma picked up the phone and nervously dialed the number Ethan had left on a napkin that night. But there was no answer. Ethan was always busy with business commitments, and his calls often went straight to voicemail. After several frustrating attempts, Emma made the bravest decision of her life. She would go to Bennett Tech's office in person and tell Ethan everything. One morning, she prepared herself and made her way to the luxurious glass building in the heart of Manhattan, where Bennett Tech was located. The contrast between her reality and the world Ethan lived in couldn't have been more stark. As she crossed the polished, elegant marble lobby, she felt the judging gazes of those around her, as if they already knew she didn't belong there. When she reached the reception, Ethan's secretary looked her up and down with disdain. "How can I help you?" the woman asked coldly. Emma took a deep breath, trying not to let the tension overwhelm her thoughts. I need to speak with Mr. Ethan Bennett. It's urgent," Emma replied, her voice trembling. "He's in a meeting right now." "What is this about?" The secretary seemed impatient, as if she was used to dealing with people wanting to talk to Ethan for trivial reasons. "It's a personal matter. Very important." Emma avoided the woman's gaze, feeling small in such an imposing place. After a few minutes of waiting, the secretary indicated that Ethan could see her for a few minutes. With her heart racing, Emma was led to Ethan's office. Upon entering, she found herself in a sophisticated space with large windows offering a panoramic view of New York. Ethan was standing reviewing documents, and when he looked up to see her, he seemed surprised. She took a deep breath before responding, trying to gather all the courage she could. "Ethan, I'm pregnant," Emma said directly, without beating around the bush. She knew there was no easy way to talk about this. For a moment, silence filled the room. Ethan blinked several times as if trying to process the information. The news had caught him completely off guard. He looked at Emma in disbelief, struggling to find words, but they all seemed to escape him. His mind began racing with questions. How was this possible? How had he, with so much control over his life and choices, gotten involved in something so unexpected? Pregnant? How? He paused, realizing the question sounded ridiculous. Of course, he knew how it had happened. The real question was, how would he deal with this now? Before he could continue, the office door swung open, and suddenly Brandon Carter, his partner and best friend, rushed in. "Ethan, we need to review the contract before the meeting," Brandon began, but quickly stopped when he saw Emma in the office. Who's she? The tension in the air was palpable, and Emma felt even more out of place. Ethan, unsure of how to react, hesitated. "Brandon, this is Emma." Ethan stopped, unsure of how to explain the situation at that moment. Brandon looked at the two of them, his expression quickly turning cynical. "Ah, I get it. One of those, huh, Ethan?" Brandon let out a laugh, assuming it was something trivial, like a fleeting conquest. That comment brought out a new layer of discomfort. Emma felt her face burn with humiliation. Ethan, still unsure how to process everything, remained silent. Too confused to firmly confront his friend's disrespectful attitude, he was too lost to react decisively. Emma, feeling completely abandoned, realized there was nothing more to do there. Without saying another word, she quickly left the office, leaving Ethan with a mix of guilt and confusion. Ethan stood still, watching the door close, unable to move or fully grasp what had just happened. When the office door closed behind Emma, a heavy tension hung in the air. Ethan Bennett was still paralyzed, trying to process what had just occurred. He, who had always had absolute control over every area of his life, now found himself completely lost. Emma, the simple woman he had met in a bakery in Brooklyn, was pregnant. and that changed everything. Brandon Carter, still unaware of the gravity of the situation, continued laughing, mocking the idea. Pregnant? Man, that's a good one. Another girl trying to trap the rich and famous with a baby. You need to handle this fast, Ethan. You can't let this story tarnish your name or the company. Brandon spoke with disdain, as if the whole situation was a joke. Ethan, however, didn't laugh. The reality that he was going to be a father began to take shape in his mind. But along with it, the weight of his choices also emerged. He knew his life was about to change radically, but he still couldn't clearly see what to do. Brandon's words echoed in his head. Tarnish your name. That was the real fear, not only for Ethan, but for everyone around him. The Bennett legacy was the priority for his mother, Margaret, and for all those who orbited around his circle of power. By the end of that day, Ethan returned home with a weight on his chest that he had never felt before. When he entered the luxurious mansion where he lived, he was immediately greeted by his mother, Margaret, who noticed something different in her son's expression. "What's wrong, Ethan? You seem troubled." She observed him closely, always alert to any sign of weakness or doubt. Ethan hesitated. He knew that telling his mother about Emma and the pregnancy would only bring more problems. Margaret was ruthless when it came to the family's reputation. Anything that slipped from her control was quickly neutralized, and Ethan knew his mother would do anything to prevent any scandal from involving the Bennett name. He could already predict the judgment that would come if Margaret discovered he had been involved with someone as common as Emma. "Nothing, Mom. Just a tiring day at work." He looked away, avoiding the interrogation he knew would come if he gave any hint. Margaret raised an eyebrow, suspicious, but chose not to press. Over the years, she had molded Ethan to be the perfect heir, and any sign of weakness in her son worried her. However, for her, work and business were everything, and she preferred to believe that his problems were limited to that. That night, as he tried to sleep, Ethan found himself reflecting on Emma's words and the reality that was coming. He was going to be a father. Emma was alone, and although Ethan had the resources and power to help her, something held him back. Was it fear of what others would say? Fear of his mother's reaction? Of Brandon's and his friends? Or was it something deeper? A reluctance to face the responsibility of being a father, of starting a family, something he had never seriously considered. He began to recall the night he met Emma, the way she made him feel relaxed, how she was different from everything he knew in his superficial world. She was genuine, honest, and for a brief moment, he had felt free by her side. Now that same woman was pregnant with his child, and he needed to make a decision. In the days that followed, Ethan tried to bury the problem, immersing himself in work, keeping busy with the demands of Bennett Tech. He believed that if he let time pass, the situation would resolve itself. Brandon, always by his side, continued to mock the situation, suggesting that Ethan consult lawyers to deal with the problem quickly, as if Emma were just an unwanted distraction. But every night, the weight of responsibility returned. Deep down, Ethan knew he couldn't simply ignore Emma and the pregnancy. He wasn't a cruel man, and the thought of letting Emma handle the situation alone bothered him. However, publicly accepting this relationship and the child to come also seemed like a risky decision. The pressure to maintain the perfect Bennett image held him back. It was during an important Bennett Tech meeting days later that the pressure became unbearable. Ethan, surrounded by executives and investors, tried to focus on the presentation of a new product, but his mind constantly wandered to Emma and the baby on the way. He felt he couldn't keep ignoring it, but he also didn't know how to find the courage to face reality. At the end of the meeting, while everyone was still in the room discussing details, Ethan felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. It was a message from Emma. "We need to talk. I can't do this alone. You have a child on the way. Please, meet me." He read and reread the message several times. Her plea was direct and sincere. She wasn't trying to manipulate or pressure him. Emma was just being honest, asking for what was fair. Ethan knew he couldn't keep hiding. He abruptly stood up from the meeting, leaving the executives and Brandon confused. "Where are you going? We're in the middle of something important," Brandon protested, but Ethan ignored him. He needed a moment to himself. He needed air, clarity. As he walked through the streets of Manhattan, he realized he was facing a dilemma that would define his life. Could he continue being the perfect heir, the son who followed his mother's rules and kept the untarnished Bennett image? Or would he finally take responsibility for his actions, accepting the consequences, no matter how difficult? Emma's words kept echoing in his mind. "You have a child on the way." That was undeniable, and Ethan knew the choice he made now wouldn't just impact his life, but also Emma's and, more importantly, his child's. Ethan looked at the skyline of skyscrapers that formed New York's profile and wondered, was he ready to be a father, to face the criticism and challenges that would come. After days of uncertainty, Ethan made his decision. He knew that running away or ignoring what was happening wasn't a viable option. Life, for the first time, had put him in a situation that couldn't be solved with money or power, and he would need to act responsibly. Emma was waiting for an answer, and more than that, he had a child on the way. The weight of that truth pushed him toward unavoidable action. That afternoon, Ethan drove to Brooklyn, where Emma lived. The neighborhood was simple, far from the glitz and glamour of Manhattan. The streets were quiet, with small houses and local shops. When he parked the car in front of the modest building where Emma lived, he felt a mix of nervousness and guilt. It had been weeks since he found out about the pregnancy, and until now, he had hesitated to reach out. But he was determined to change that. Emma was waiting for him at the building's entrance. When she saw him, her heart raced, not with joy, but with uncertainty. She had spent sleepless nights imagining what she would say to Ethan when he finally showed up. For weeks, she had felt abandoned, dealing alone with the fears and concerns of pregnancy. Now that he was there, Emma didn't know if it was a good or bad sign. "Hi, Ethan," Emma said, her voice hesitant as she crossed her arms, trying to hide her nervousness. "Hi, Emma, can we talk?" Ethan asked, trying to sound calm, but it was clear he was also tense. She nodded and led him to the small apartment she shared with her mother, who was at a medical appointment at that moment. The apartment was simple but cozy. As he entered, Ethan was struck by the stark difference between this place and the mansion he lived in. It was as if he were stepping into a completely new world. They sat at the kitchen table, and the silence that followed was uncomfortable. Ethan looked around, noticing the details of Emma's life. The old photos of her with her mother on the wall, the recipe notebooks on the table, and the low hum of the TV, tuned to a cooking show. He wasn't used to such simplicity, and it only heightened his sense of displacement. "Emma, I'm sorry it took me so long to show up," he began, breaking the silence. I needed time to process everything. It's not an easy situation for me, as I imagine it isn't for you either." Emma looked at him, her eyes expressing a mixture of hurt and hope. She knew Ethan's life was different from hers, but that didn't justify his absence. However, she also knew that now wasn't the time to dig up old resentments. "I understand you have your life, Ethan, but I have mine too." And now, she placed her hand on her belly, highlighting the pregnancy. "We have another life to take care of. I'm not asking you for anything more than what's fair. I just want you to be present. Not for me, but for our child." Emma's words hit Ethan deeply. He knew she was right. Running away wasn't an option, and he wanted to be a present father, even though he didn't know exactly how. This was a new world for him, a world of responsibilities and sacrifices he had never experienced. Until now, his life had been devoted to himself, to work, and to the Bennett legacy, but that all seemed small compared to what was coming. "I want to be present, Emma," Ethan said sincerely. "I want to help you and take care of our child. I know I haven't been the man I should be, but I'm here now, and I want to do what's right." Emma took a deep breath, relieved to finally hear those words, but at the same time, skeptical. Words were easy, but she would need to see concrete actions to believe that Ethan was truly willing to change. "All right, Ethan, but I'm not expecting promises. I'm expecting you to prove yourself, not just to me, but especially to our child." She kept her tone firm, showing that she wasn't willing to depend on empty words. Ethan nodded. He knew it would be a long road to regain Emma's trust and prove he was committed to this new reality. He then decided to start with a practical step, taking care of Emma's most immediate needs. "I know you don't want anything from me, but I want to help financially. I know things aren't easy, especially with your mother being ill. I can do this without complicating things between us," Ethan suggested, trying to find a way to ease the situation. Emma looked at him for a moment. Her pride wanted to refuse, but she knew she needed help, and more importantly, it wouldn't be fair to deprive their child of the resources Ethan could provide. She agreed, as long as it didn't mean he could buy his way back into her life. "All right, Ethan. I accept your help, but remember, this isn't about me. It's about our child." Her tone was serious, and Ethan realized Emma wasn't interested in his money, but in the commitment he needed to make. With that, Ethan began arranging everything Emma would need during the pregnancy, from medical appointments to financial support for her mother, all done discreetly without imposing on or interfering in Emma's personal life. He also began visiting Emma more frequently, trying to get accustomed to the new reality forming around him. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan continued his efforts to be more present. Despite Emma's wary looks, still waiting for more solid proof of his commitment, he started feeling more connected to the idea of becoming a father. Each visit to Emma, Every conversation about the baby's future brought a new sense of responsibility to Ethan. However, even with these efforts, the external pressures around Ethan didn't ease. Brandon, still not taking the situation seriously, continued insisting that he move on and return to his old life. And Margaret, his mother, was still completely in the dark about what was happening. As time went on, the situation between Ethan and Emma seemed to stabilize somewhat. He was making efforts to be more present in her life and was gradually starting to see himself in the role of a future father. Emma, meanwhile, kept her guard up, though she was relieved to see Ethan finally taking on part of the responsibility. However, the fragile balance they had built began to crack when external reality, which had been controlled so far, started to press in. The first sign that things were about to change came in the form of an unexpected phone call from Margaret Bennett. That morning, Ethan was in his office at Bennett Tech when his phone rang. It was his mother, Margaret. The tone of her voice already hinted that something was wrong. "Ethan, I need to talk to you immediately. Come home now." His mother rarely demanded anything so directly, and that put Ethan on alert. He finished what he was doing and went to the Bennett mansion. Upon arriving, he found Margaret in the living room with a serious expression on her face and the phone in her hand. She looked at him with cold eyes. "Sit down, Ethan," she said bluntly. Unsure of what to expect, Ethan obeyed. Margaret observed him for a moment, as if assessing her son before she began speaking. "I got a call from a gossip magazine today. They want to confirm an absurd story they're about to publish. A certain woman named Emma Davis. And a baby." Margaret paused, letting the gravity of her words echo through the room. "So, do you have something to tell me, Ethan?" Ethan felt his heart race. He knew this moment would come, but he didn't expect it to be so soon. The truth about Emma's pregnancy was about to become public, and his mother clearly knew enough to demand an explanation. "Mom, I was going to tell you," Ethan began, trying to stay calm. "Emma is pregnant. She's having my child." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Margaret looked at him with a mixture of anger and disappointment. To her, the situation was more than just an inconvenience. It was a direct attack on the Bennett family's reputation, something she had always fought to protect. "I knew you were making some questionable choices, Ethan. But this? Getting involved with a woman like that? And getting her pregnant?" She spoke with disdain, her voice filled with indignation. "Do you have any idea what this could do to the Bennett name? Our reputation is at stake. Mom, I know this isn't what you expected, but Emma is a decent person. She's not like you're imagining." Ethan tried to defend Emma, but he knew his mother wouldn't accept it easily. Margaret stood up, beginning to pace around the room. "It doesn't matter who she is, Ethan. What matters is that you've made a colossal mistake, and now we're all going to pay for it." Margaret stopped in front of her son, her eyes burning with a mixture of rage and desperation. "This needs to be dealt with. You're going to make it clear to this woman that there's no place for her in our lives. And as for this child, we can handle that discreetly without anyone knowing. I won't allow the legacy of our family to be destroyed by some opportunistic girl from Brooklyn." Ethan was shocked by his mother's words. The cold way she referred to Emma and even to her own grandchild disturbed him deeply. Ethan, who had always followed Margaret's orders, realized he couldn't keep going down the path she had laid out for him. "Mom, I'm not going to do that," Ethan said, his voice firmer than he expected. "I've already made my decision. I'm going to be a father, and I'm going to be part of my child's life, whether you accept it or not." Margaret, who was rarely challenged, was visibly surprised by Ethan's resistance. "Ethan, you have no idea what the consequences of this are. Do you think you can just go on with your life, ignoring everything this situation means?" Her voice now was colder, full of threat. "I'm not ignoring anything, Mom, but I won't turn my back on Emma or my child. I've made mistakes in the past, but I'm trying to do what's right now." Ethan stood up, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders as he finally stood up to his mother. Margaret stared at him for a few seconds, and realizing that Ethan wouldn't change his mind, her expression shifted. The contempt gave way to a calculated coldness. "Very well, Ethan. If that's what you want, you're on your own." Margaret crossed her arms, casting a sharp look at her son. "But know this. When everything falls apart, you'll realize you've made the biggest mistake of your life." Ethan left the family mansion feeling the impact of the conversation with his mother. For years, he had allowed himself to be shaped by Margaret's expectations, but now he knew that the only way forward was to make his own decisions. However, the weight of the choice left him uneasy. It wasn't just his mother's disapproval that worried him, but the inevitable fallout when the news spread. Meanwhile, Emma began to realize that her life was also about to change drastically. Though she was relieved by Ethan's growing support, she knew that they wouldn't be able to avoid media attention for long. The first headlines started to appear on local gossip blogs, mentioning Ethan Bennett's name and a mysterious woman from Brooklyn, rumored to be expecting his child. Emma tried to stay strong, but the pressure began to affect her. At the bakery where she worked, customers whispered as she passed. Some looked at her with disdain, others with curiosity. She knew that being associated with one of New York's most powerful families would bring judgment, but the intensity of the situation began to suffocate her. At work, her boss approached her in a tense moment. "Emma, I think we need to talk," he said with a concerned tone. "People are talking. I don't want to pressure you, but I think you should consider taking a leave. This is becoming complicated for us too." Emma was stunned. It was as if everything. Brandon, who had been his longtime ally and friend, began to distance himself gradually. With the media pressure and the Bennett family's tension weighing on Ethan, the business began to feel the impact. Brandon, always pragmatic, started suggesting that Ethan cut the problem at its root. "You're losing focus, Ethan. The company is suffering because of this mess. If you don't fix this soon, you're going to lose more than just your mother's trust." Brandon spoke bluntly. But Ethan was no longer willing to sacrifice his dignity or his new responsibility in the name of business or reputation. The following weeks were a true test for Ethan and Emma. The weight of the pregnancy, the unwanted media attention, and Margaret's continued disapproval left the couple in a constant state of tension. While Ethan was determined to be part of Emma's and their child's lives, the obstacles around them seemed insurmountable. For Emma, the reality of becoming a headline in New York's society columns was a nightmare. The bakery where she worked was no longer the quiet refuge it once was. Curious people followed her home, photographers camped outside her building, and rumors about her personal life seemed to grow every day. While proud of her independence, Emma felt the constant pressure of being in the spotlight. The privacy she once cherished was quickly disappearing. Amid all this, Ethan continued juggling his professional life and attempts to care for Emma. However, Bennett Tech began to feel the impact of Ethan's personal distractions. The pressure for results increased, and Brandon Carter, his business partner, no longer hid his dissatisfaction. One day, as Ethan was about to leave the office to visit Emma, Brandon intercepted him in the hallway. "Ethan, the company is falling apart, and you're losing focus." "This thing with Emma, with the baby," Brandon spoke seriously, without the mocking tone he used to have. "It's costing more than you realize. We have important meetings with investors this week, and if you're not 100% focused, we could lose everything." Ethan, who had been trying to balance both parts of his life, began to feel the weight of Brandon's words. He knew that the business was important, and that Bennett Tech's image was directly tied to its success. However, something inside him had changed in the past few months. Becoming a father, taking responsibility for Emma and their child, all of it began to transform how he saw the world and especially his priorities. But Ethan didn't realize how deep the cracks ran until that day. Brandon, his longtime business partner and friend, had hidden intentions that Ethan hadn't noticed. Tired of the distraction Emma represented and worried about the company's future, Brandon had started making his own moves behind the scenes. While he encouraged Ethan to quickly resolve his personal problems, Brandon was planning a silent coup to remove Ethan from the leadership of Bennett Tech and take full control of the company. Brandon, shrewd and calculating, had gained the trust of many investors over the years, and with Ethan more involved in his personal life than the business, the time was perfect for a takeover. With a plan already in motion, he began scheduling secret meetings with the company's major shareholders, framing Ethan as someone who had lost focus and whose leadership was no longer effective. He argued that Ethan's personal relationship with Emma and the media scandal were driving investors away and jeopardizing the company's future. Meanwhile, across town, Emma began to feel something changing in her pregnancy. After a few days of discomfort and pains that seemed unusual, she decided to schedule an appointment with her doctor. She was already far along in her pregnancy, and every detail about her and the baby's health was a cause for concern. Ethan, preoccupied with the growing problems at the company, couldn't accompany her to the appointment, but promised to be there for the next one. Alone in the clinic's waiting room, Emma felt a rising unease. The time spent dealing with external pressure, the relentless media, and suspicious glances from neighbors were starting to take a toll on her emotionally. When the doctor called her in, a slight tightness formed in her chest. During the examination, the doctor, an experienced and calm man, carefully reviewed the results. Emma noticed he was taking longer than usual, which worried her. "Doctor, is everything all right?" she asked, unable to hide the nervousness in her voice. The doctor looked at Emma with a serious yet reassuring expression. "Emma, there's something we need to discuss," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Your pregnancy has been healthy so far, but there are some complications that could arise in the coming days. The baby seems to be developing well, but you'll need extra care in the next few weeks. I want you to take complete rest and avoid any kind of stress." The words, complications and complete rest, echoed in Emma's mind. She had spent months enduring media pressure, social judgment, and uncertainties about Ethan, and now her body was starting to give in. The baby's health depended on her calm and care, something she wasn't sure she could maintain with everything happening around her. When Ethan found out about Emma's condition, he immediately left work and rushed to her apartment. Entering, he found Emma lying on the couch, clearly shaken. "Emma, what happened?" "I came as soon as I heard," he said, kneeling beside her, his concern evident in his voice. Emma looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "The doctor said I need to rest, Ethan. Everything is becoming too hard. The baby needs me to stay calm, but how can I do that? There are photographers at the door, people judging me at work, and now I'm not even sure I can have this baby in good health." Ethan felt a tightness in his chest. He knew Emma was right. As much as he wanted to be present, their lives were spiraling out of control. The media, the company problems, and the external pressure. All of it was overwhelming the woman he had come to admire deeply. "Emma, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. I should have protected you better," Ethan said, holding her hand, determined to make things right. "But I promise, from now on, I'll do whatever it takes. You and our child are my priority." Emma, still shaken, simply nodded. She wanted to believe in Ethan's words, but the chaos around them was greater than either of them could imagine. Yet the biggest turning point was still to come. The next day, when Ethan arrived at Bennett Tech for an emergency meeting with the investors, he was greeted with strange looks. The atmosphere in the office was tense, and Brandon, once his ally, seemed distant and cold. Ethan entered the meeting room and, to his surprise, found the key shareholders seated at the table, along with Brandon. Before he could speak, Brandon stood up. "Ethan, I think everyone here agrees that we need to discuss the company's future. The current situation, your personal life, is hurting Bennett Tech. And after conversations with the shareholders, we've decided that you're no longer in a position to lead the company at this time." Brandon's words hit like a bomb. Ethan was in shock. He had been betrayed by his best friend and was about to lose control of the company his father had built. "Brandon, what are you doing?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "What's best for Bennett Tech?" Brandon replied, unflinching. "The shareholders agree. You're out, Ethan." The betrayal consumed Ethan, and the realization that his closest friend had orchestrated his downfall left him reeling. He had never imagined that his best friend, someone he trusted completely, would be capable of such treachery. What was supposed to be a routine meeting with the shareholders had turned into a trial where he was deemed guilty of being distracted by his personal life. Brandon's justification seemed rehearsed, and the investors, worried about the financial repercussions of Ethan's image, sided with him. With the company slipping from his grasp, Ethan left the meeting room feeling utterly defeat. He didn't know how to turn the situation around. On top of the conflict at the company, there was the even more delicate issue, Emma and their child. She needed him more than ever, especially after the doctor's orders for complete rest. Ethan was trapped between two enormous responsibilities, and the weight of both was starting to crush him. He knew the time to make a critical decision was running out. As he walked through the empty halls of Bennett Tech, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about everything at stake. He had lost the trust of the shareholders, his mother was furious, and the media continued to fuel the scandal surrounding Emma. But what hurt the most was Brandon's betrayal. They had built that empire together, and now his best friend was ready to take it all. Leaving the building, Ethan got into his car and drove aimlessly through the streets of Manhattan. His mind was in turmoil. For years, he had dedicated his life to the legacy of Bennett Tech, believing that his identity and worth were tied to the company's success. Now, with control of the company slipping through his fingers, he wondered if it was even worth fighting to keep. He needed answers, but he knew he wouldn't find them in New York's skyscrapers. Instead, his thoughts returned to Emma. She was the only constant amid all the chaos. Ethan realized that while he had been fighting to save his name and the company, he had been neglecting the most important person in his life at that moment, the mother of his child. It was then that, for the first time, a surprising clarity emerged in his mind. He had always tried to please everyone, his mother, the investors, his friends, but in doing so, he lost sight of what truly mattered, his own identity and the people who genuinely needed him. The decision was clear. He would choose Emma and their child above all else. If losing the company was the price to pay, then he was willing to accept it. Back at Emma's apartment, the atmosphere was tense. She had already sensed that something wasn't right with Ethan. Despite his promises to be present, he seemed increasingly distant, wrapped up in company matters and external problems. Emma, now on bed rest, reflected on her life and what she really wanted for her future. The pregnancy had brought irreversible changes, and although she still loved Ethan in some way, she wasn't sure if she could trust him to be the father he had promised to be. The stress of being constantly in the media's spotlight and facing judgment from everyone around her weighed more heavily each day. That afternoon, as Emma rested on the couch, she heard a knock at the door. Her heart raced. Every visit from Ethan stirred a mix of hope and uncertainty. When she opened the door, there he was, with an expression that blended determination and regret. "Emma, we need to talk," Ethan said as he entered the apartment. His voice was calm, but there was a tension Emma had never seen before. She invited him to sit, and for a moment, silence hung between them. I've lost control of the company," Ethan began, his voice faltering as he admitted the harsh reality. "Brandon betrayed me. He took over Bennett Tech, and now the investors are siding with him." Ethan paused, trying to process everything he was feeling. Emma, who had been unaware of the details of Ethan's professional life, looked at him with surprise but remained calm. "I'm sorry, Ethan, but why are you telling me this now?" she asked, trying to understand what he expected from her. Ethan sighed, leaning forward, his hands on his head. He knew the words he was about to. "Because I've realized that all this time I've been fighting for the wrong things. I was trying to save the company, trying to live up to the image my mother and the shareholders expected of me. But what really matters, Emma, is you and our child." He looked up at her, his eyes shining with sincerity. "I don't want to waste any more time fighting for something that doesn't define me. Bennett Tech, my family. None of that is more important than the two of you." Emma remained silent, absorbing Ethan's words. She hadn't expected him to say something like that, especially now, when everything around them seemed to be falling apart. Deep down, she had always doubted that Ethan could give up power and prestige to truly be present in her and the baby's life. However, this time his words felt different. There was a genuine conviction. "Ethan, are you really willing to leave all that behind?" Emma asked, still incredulous. "I always thought that, more than anything, you'd be unable to walk away from that life." "I was unable, until now," Ethan admitted, his voice laden with honesty. "But losing the company made me realize that none of it matters if I lose you and our child. I don't want you to face all this alone, Emma. I don't want to be the kind of absent father my father was." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I want to build something new with you. I can't change the past, but I can change who I am moving forward." His words hit Emma deeply. She had always been strong and independent, but hearing Ethan admit his mistakes and commit to changing stirred something inside her. As much as she resented everything she had faced alone, she wanted to believe that finally he was ready to do what was right. "I want to believe you, Ethan," Emma said, her eyes filling with tears. "But I need to see your actions. Words alone won't fix this. I need you to be present. Our child needs you." Ethan nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. He knew that regaining Emma's trust would be a process, not something that could be resolved with empty promises. But for the first time, he was willing to make the necessary sacrifices. "I'll be here, Emma. From now on, I'm your partner in this. We'll face everything together," he replied firmly, reaching out to hold her hand. Emma accepted the touch, feeling a slight warmth of hope. She knew there was still much to face, but in that moment, she chose to give Ethan a second chance. The battle wasn't over, but his decision to prioritize family above all else was a first step. The following days were a time of transition. Now free from the pressures of the company, Ethan devoted himself entirely to Emma and the baby. He accompanied her to medical appointments and made sure her surroundings were as calm and safe as possible. The media still tried to exploit the story, but over time, the focus diminished, and the external pressure eased. On the other hand, Brandon took over Bennett Tech, but things didn't go as planned. Without Ethan, the investors realized he had been the true creative force behind the company's innovations. Without him, projects began to fail, and confidence in Brandon's leadership plummeted. The coup he had orchestrated started to unravel as the press began to question the company's new management. Without Ethan, Bennett Tech was no longer the same. But for Ethan, real success was no longer about business. His priority had shifted to build a family with Emma and their child, far from the pressures of his past. The days following Ethan's decision to step away from the business and focus on his family were intense, both emotionally and physically. Emma still needed rest and medical care, but now she was no longer alone. Ethan was present, caring for her and preparing for the birth of their child. The tension and uncertainty slowly eased, but life still had one final test in store, one that would challenge everything he had decided. Though Ethan was no longer responsible for Bennett Tech, the company's situation continued to unfold. Brandon Carter, now in charge, struggled to keep the company stable. Ethan's absence as the creative and charismatic face of the business left a void Brandon couldn't fill. Investors began questioning his decisions, and internal problems escalated. News of mass layoffs and failed projects began circulating, tarnishing the company's reputation. Ethan, on the other hand, tried to stay away from it all. He knew the chaos at Bennett Tech was an inevitable consequence of Brandon's betrayal, but his priority was elsewhere now. However, as the corporate chaos unfolded, a more personal issue arose. Margaret Bennett, his mother. Since learning of Emma's pregnancy, Margaret had distanced herself from Ethan, making it clear that she disapproved of his choices. To her, her son's life was falling apart, and she believed he was making a mistake by getting involved with Emma and stepping away from the business. Ethan, for his part, felt that this break with his mother, though painful, was necessary for him to move forward with his new life. One day, while caring for Emma at her apartment, Ethan received an unexpected call from Margaret. "Ethan, we need to talk," said her voice, firm but with a slight hesitation he hadn't expected. "Come to the house, please. It's important." Ethan hesitated for a moment, but decided he needed to face this last obstacle. His relationship with his mother had always been complex, but he knew that he needed a definitive conversation to close that chapter. If he wanted to build a new life with Emma and their child, he had to deal with his past, and Margaret represented the biggest ghost of that past. He told Emma he would be gone for a few hours and drove to the Bennett mansion. Upon arriving, he was greeted by the familiar grandeur of the place. But this time, the emotional weight felt lighter. Ethan was different. He knew what he wanted, and that gave him a strength he hadn't had before. Margaret was sitting in the grand living room, her posture still impeccable. When she saw Ethan enter, she kept her gaze steady, but there was a hidden sadness in her eyes. He approached and sat across from her, prepared for the confrontation he knew was inevitable. "Ethan," Margaret began, her voice controlled, but with a tone that hinted at weariness. "I've always wanted the best for you. Everything I did was to protect our family's legacy, to ensure you had the future you deserved. But it seems that somewhere along the way, I lost control over you." Ethan remained silent, listening but not letting himself be affected by the manipulation that had worked so many times in the past. "I don't understand why you're throwing everything away. This woman, Emma, she doesn't belong in our world. You know that." Margaret's voice sounded almost desperate. "Bennett Tech is collapsing, and you're letting it happen because of a distraction." Ethan took a deep breath, knowing this was the moment to end years of emotional control. "Mom, I understand that you always wanted the best for me, but what you never understood is that I don't want the life you planned for me. What you consider important, power, reputation, money, that's never what made me happy. And for the first time, I know exactly what I want," Ethan replied, his voice calm but determined. "I want to be with Emma and our child. They are my priority now, not Bennett Tech or what people think of me." Margaret shook her head in disbelief, as if she couldn't accept the reality in front of her. "You're throwing your life away for a woman who will drag you down, Ethan. What do you think is going to happen? That she'll make you happy? She's not like us. She's exactly the opposite of us, Mom." Ethan interrupted, his voice firm. And I need you to understand that if I have to choose between continuing to be the perfect son for you or being the father my child deserves, I'm choosing my child." Those words hung in the air, heavy yet liberating. Margaret, visibly shaken, realized she was losing control over her son. For the first time, she saw Ethan as a man capable of making his own decisions, and that frightened her. She knew the argument of power and control would no longer work. "So that's it? You're going to abandon me like your father did?" Her voice trembled slightly, revealing her fear of being left alone. Ethan remained silent for a moment, reflecting on the life of control his mother had always led. For the first time, he understood that her behavior was driven by fear. Fear of losing everything, of being left behind. However, he also knew he couldn't continue to be manipulated by that fear. "I'm not abandoning you, Mom, but I won't let myself be controlled either. If you want to be part of my life, it will be on my terms. I can't keep living by your expectation." Ethan stood up, feeling lighter than at any other moment in his life. "I need to go now. Emma needs me, and so does my child." Margaret didn't say another word. She just watched as Ethan walked away, her gaze lost in thought. She knew he had made his choice, and although it devastated her, it was also a painful lesson about what it truly means to love unconditionally. Back at Emma's apartment, Ethan arrived just as she was getting ready to go to the hospital. The pregnancy pains had intensified, and it seemed the baby was ready to come into the world. He helped her into the car, and together they drove to the hospital, where they would experience the most transformative moment of their lives. The hours that followed were filled with anxiety and emotion. Ethan, by Emma's side, held her hand as she endured the pain of labor. He was there, present, as he had promised. And after a long and exhausting night, the soft cry of a baby echoed through the delivery room. Ethan looked at his son for the first time and felt an overwhelming emotion take over his heart. Nothing in his life had prepared him for that moment. All the struggles, all the difficult decisions, all the losses, everything seemed insignificant now that he held his son in his arms. Emma, exhausted, smiled at him, feeling that despite all the challenges, they had finally arrived where they needed to be. "He's perfect," Ethan said, tears in his eyes, looking at Emma and then at their son. Emma simply nodded, feeling a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. There, in that hospital, a new life was beginning for Ethan, Emma, and their child. The legacy he was building now was no longer made of business, money, or power, but of love, family, and true choices. The soft cry of the baby filled the hospital room, and Ethan felt more complete than he ever could have imagined. The weight of the world, which had once seemed to suffocate him, now dissipated into a pure and profound feeling of love. He held his newborn son in his arms, feeling the fragility and the promise of a new and different future. Emma, lying in bed, watched the scene with a tired but happy smile. Everything they had been through, the betrayals, the pressure, society's judgment, now seemed distant and insignificant. Ethan never imagined his life would take this turn. He had always believed the Bennett destiny was tied to business success and preserving the family legacy, but holding his son, he realized the true legacy was far greater than any business empire. It was about family, love, and the choices we make to protect those who matter most. After a few moments of reflection, Ethan handed the baby back to Emma, who held him with tenderness and emotion. They exchanged a look of complicity, as if all the uncertainties of the past were being replaced by a new certainty. They were in this together. "How are you feeling?" Ethan asked, his voice gentle as he approached the bed. "Tired, but happy." Emma looked at the baby in her arms and smiled. "I never thought we'd make it here, Ethan, but I'm glad you're by my side. And now, with our son, everything seems to make sense." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of his responsibilities, but also the clarity of his choice. "Me too, Emma. Thank you for giving me this chance, for believing in me, even when I didn't deserve it. I promise I'll never let you down again." He took Emma's hand, feeling the warmth and trust she now placed in him. Emma squeezed his hand in return, but didn't need to say anything. She knew the journey to get there had been tough, but now they were ready to build a life together. Deep down, there were still fears and uncertainties, but they knew they could overcome them together. The following days were full of adjustments and learning. Ethan spent every possible moment by Emma's and the baby's side, helping with care and building a deep bond with his son. He discovered how transformative and challenging fatherhood could be. Every sleepless night, every diaper change, and every unexpected cry was a new challenge he was willing to face with Emma by his side. Meanwhile, the situation at Bennett Tech continued to worsen. Brandon, who had taken full control of the company, watched projects fail and shareholders pull away. The investors, who once believed that Ethan's leadership was the problem, began to realize that Brandon lacked the vision or charisma to lead the company. Within a few months, the company was on the verge of financial collapse, and the stock plummeted. Business headlines, which had once focused on the Ethan Bennett scandal, now concentrated on Bennett Tech's decline under Brandon's leadership. Gradually, the truth came to light. Without Ethan, the company couldn't innovate or thrive. Investors began to pressure Brandon, and many started selling their shares, fearing the company's uncertain future. Ethan, however, remained distant from that reality. He had made his choice, and for the first time, he felt at peace not being involved in the corporate chaos. He knew Brandon had betrayed his trust and destroyed what they had built together, but he also knew that fighting for the company would mean giving up his new life with Emma and their child. And that was a fight he wasn't willing to take on. A few weeks after the baby was born, Ethan received an unexpected visit. He was at home, rocking his son, when he heard the doorbell ring. Opening the door, he found Brandon, visibly worn and tense. The man who had once been his best friend now looked exhausted, like someone who had lost everything. "Ethan, I need to talk to you," Brandon said, his voice trembling. Ethan stood silent for a moment, surprised by the visit. He hadn't seen Brandon since the day he was ousted from Bennett Tech and betrayed by him. Now, standing before him, was a broken man, very different from the confident and arrogant Brandon who had taken control of the company. "Come in," Ethan said, maintaining a neutral but curious tone. Brandon entered and sat on the couch, running his hands over his face as if searching for the right word. Ethan waited, unhurried, sensing that what was about to be said would be important. I messed everything up, Ethan. Bennett Tech is going under. The shareholders are pressuring me. The projects aren't working, and I just don't know what to do. Brandon's voice was filled with desperation. I thought I could lead the company on my own, but I can't, not without you. Ethan remained silent, reflecting on Brandon's words. Part of him still felt anger over what his former friend had done, over the betrayal that had nearly destroyed his life. However, he also knew that Brandon was paying the price for his choices, and now he was here, vulnerable, asking for help. You made your decisions, Brandon. You chose the path you wanted to take, and now you're dealing with the consequences of that, Ethan said, his voice firm. I've already made my choice. I'm not going back to Bennett Tech. I have a new priority now. Brandon looked at Ethan, surprised. But you're going to let the company sink? Your father built that, Ethan. You're the only one. Ethan looked Brandon straight in the eyes. If the company falls, then let it fall. I've made my choice. Brandon looked devastated. He knew there was nothing more he could say to convince Ethan to return. The betrayal had destroyed the trust between them, and now he understood that Ethan had distanced himself from a world that no longer fulfilled him. I'm sorry, Ethan, Brandon said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I never wanted things to end like this. Ethan simply nodded. Neither did I, Brandon. But sometimes things need to end so that we can start something new. Brandon stood, realizing that his search for redemption wouldn't be fulfilled in the way he had hoped. He left the apartment, leaving Ethan at peace with his decision. In the months that followed, Bennett Tech collapsed completely. The company that had once been a technology empire crumbled under Brandon's poor management, and the Bennett name was slowly dissociated from the business. But Ethan didn't care. He had built a new legacy, one he knew was worth far more than any company. With Emma by his side and his son growing up healthy, Ethan discovered that true wealth lay in the relationships we build and the love we dedicate to those who matter most. He still carried the Bennett name, but now he defined what that meant. Being a present father, a reliable partner, and above all, a man who had learned to make his own choices. Ethan Bennett's life had completely transformed. Months had passed since Bennett Tech's collapse, and the name that once dominated New York's business world now represented something entirely different. A man who, after many internal and external struggles, decided to give up power and fortune to focus on what really mattered. The new balance he built alongside Emma and their son was simple, but profound. They lived a quiet life in Brooklyn, far from the spotlight and the pressures of high society. Emma, fully recovered from childbirth and in great shape, had finally fulfilled her dream of opening a small bakery in the neighborhood. With Ethan's financial and emotional support, the business began to thrive. The bakery became a welcoming meeting place for locals, and soon Emma's creations gained a reputation. People didn't just come for the sweets, but for the warm atmosphere she cultivated. For Emma, seeing the success of her work and caring for her son with Ethan by her side was the realization of a life she had never thought possible. The trust between her and Ethan had been rebuilt, not through words, but through everyday actions. He was there, in every moment, not just as a devoted father, but also as a present partner, ready to share the responsibilities and joys of their life together. It's funny how things have changed, Emma said one afternoon, as she closed the bakery after a busy day. Ethan stood by her side, cradling their son, now nearly a year old. A year ago, everything seemed so complicated, so distant. Ethan smiled, nodding in agreement. He too reflected on the journey they had traveled. I think sometimes you have to go through all that to finally understand what really matters, he replied, his gaze resting on their son who was sleeping in his arms. I never thought that being here, far from what I knew as success, could make me feel so complete. Emma looked at him with a soft smile. She had witnessed Ethan's transformation. The arrogant and lost man she had met in the Brooklyn bakery had become someone more humble, more genuine. The journey they had lived together brought pain, but also a lot of learning. They no longer needed the approval of high society or the weight of family expectations. They had built something authentic, in their own way. One Sunday morning, Ethan, Emma, and their son strolled through the park, enjoying the soft autumn sun. Life now moved at a simple pace, but that didn't mean it wasn't full of meaning. Ethan, who once lived for meetings, deadlines, and major business decisions, now spent his days immersed in small joys. His son's first steps, casual conversations with Emma, and walks through the neighborhood that once seemed so distant from his world. Margaret Bennett, on the other hand, remained distant. After her final conversation with Ethan, She understood that she had lost the control she had always maintained over her son's life. Although she tried to keep up appearances and pride, over time, the emptiness and distance made her reflect. One afternoon, while Ethan and Emma were enjoying a quiet visit to the bakery, Margaret appeared at the door. Emma, surprised, recognized her immediately, although they had never met in person. "Ethan, your mother is here," Emma said in a calm but visibly apprehensive tone. Ethan, who was playing with his son on the floor, stood up, surprised by the unexpected visit. He hadn't seen his mother since the decisive confrontation at her house. Margaret entered hesitant, observing the simple but cozy environment. It was a stark contrast to the mansion where she lived, but there was something about it that moved her. Perhaps it was the simplicity of the life Ethan had chosen, or the genuine smile Emma offered as she greeted her. "Can I talk to you, Ethan?" Margaret asked, her voice softer than he remembered. Ethan nodded, though still cautious. He knew his mother wasn't someone who changed easily. However, time and loneliness had affected her. The two moved to a table in the corner, while Emma discreetly returned to the counter, leaving them to talk. I wanted to see you. I needed to see you," Margaret began, with a look of regret in her eyes. "Since you left, and the company," she hesitated, seeming to struggle to find the right words. "I realized that I spent my whole life trying to control you. I wanted you to be the man I thought your father should have been, but I never stopped to listen to what you really wanted." Ethan listened attentively, noticing the sincerity in his mother's words. She wasn't there to argue or manipulate, as she had so often done in the past. Something in her had changed. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose my grandson," Margaret continued, her eyes filling with tears. "I can't change the past, but I want to somehow be part of the future, if you'll allow me." Ethan was silent for a moment. His mother's pride had always been her barrier, but seeing her like this, vulnerable and willing to admit her mistakes, touched him deeply. He knew forgiveness wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that life, with all its complications, was too short to live with resentment. "I appreciate your words, Mom, and I think we all deserve a second chance," he replied calmly. "If you're willing to get to know the life I'm building with Emma and our son, there's room for you." Margaret breathed a sigh of relief, her eyes brimming with gratitude. She knew the path to rebuilding her relationship with Ethan would be long, but at that moment she felt she had taken the first step. In the months that followed, Margaret began visiting Emma's bakery regularly, trying to reconnect with her son and grandson. Although she was still learning to navigate life outside the high society circle, Margaret began to understand that true happiness wasn't found in appearances or power, but in the bonds we build with those we love. Emma's bakery continued to grow, and the small Brooklyn neighborhood became the home where Ethan and Emma created their new life. The challenges of the past now seemed distant. The new balance they found was stable, built on trust, love, and honesty. Ethan, who once believed his destiny was tied to business and prestige, now lived a life of peace, knowing that his greatest. And so, with the sun setting behind the buildings of New York, Ethan, Emma, and their son walked hand in hand along the sidewalk in Brooklyn. Life had its ups and downs, but now they were ready for any challenge that came their way, knowing that together they could face whatever the future held. Thank you so much for following